Wyoming Territory, spring of 1874. The wind carried dust and the smell of horses through the small town of Lawson Creek, where one man bought a wife for $2. Cade Jensen stepped down from his roan gelding in front of the sheriff's office, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a dull thud. He was 29, tall, weathered, and quiet as the mountain wind. A man who had earned every scar on his hands and every silence in his eyes. He had come to town for supplies, not a wife. But fate had a cruel way of changing plans. The auction had drawn a small crowd just outside the saloon, 15 men and one woman, her wrists bound in front, a bruise darkening her left cheekbone. Sheriff Dugan stood beside her, his arms folded, his face tight. "She ain't a slave," the sheriff growled. "She's been abandoned, left behind by a trader who ran south. No next of kin. No marriage papers. No law says she has to rot in a jail cell or starve in the street. If any man's willing to offer her a home, speak now." The woman didn't look down. She stared straight ahead, chin up, though her hands trembled. Her dress was torn at the hem, boots too big, hair braided tight like someone had once taught her to keep it neat. She couldn't have been more than 20. "Name's Odella Nash," the sheriff added. "She's legal age. Can work, cook, raid, and shoot. That's more than most." Cade stepped forward before he had time to think. $2, he said. The crowd hushed. The sheriff stared at him. "You serious?" Cade nodded once. "I will not touch her unless she wants it. I have a cabin, cattle, and I live clean. She will be safe." Odella turned to him then. Her eyes were green, sharp, and full of disbelief. The sheriff glanced at her. "You agree?" Her voice was hoarse but clear. "Better than the alternative." The coins clinked in Dugan's palm. "Done." Cade untied her wrists himself. Her skin was cold. She didn't move away. They rode out together, her behind him on the saddle, not speaking, the mountains swallowing them whole by nightfall. His cabin sat on a bluff above Black Elk River. 2 rooms, smoke curling from the chimney. He gave her the bed and took the floor. She slept without a sound, limbs curled in tight. By morning she had washed, braided her hair again, and stood by the stove frying salt pork in silence. He sat at the table and watched her. "You will not have to earn your keep," he said. "I want to," she replied, flipping the meat. "I ain't charity." He nodded. Odella worked like she had always belonged there. She patched the roof with him, planted onions and beans, scrubbed the floorboards till they gleamed. She never smiled, not once, but her hands were steady and her eyes missed nothing. By the 3rd week, she started asking questions. "You ever been married?" "No." "Why $2?" Cade shrugged. "It was all I had in my pocket." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have walked away." "I did not want to." She looked away then, mouth tight. He noticed things. How she flinched when thunder rolled. How she never let her back face a doorway. How she slept with her boots tucked close. One morning, she stood on the porch holding a small rag doll. It had been stuffed down in the rafter beams above the bed. Her hands shook as she held it. "This was hers," she whispered. "Whose?" "My daughter. Her name was Mayra." Cade stepped out beside her. "Where is she now?" "Gone. The trader left her at a mission house near Fort Laramie. Said she was sick and slowing us down. I was not there. I was trading pelts with his brother. Came back and she was gone." Cade's jaw locked. "Then we will find her." Odella turned to him, disbelief breaking across her face like sunlight through the clouds. "Why?" He didn't look away. "Because she is yours." They left the next morning, riding hard with his savings sewn into his coat lining. It took 5 days to reach the mission house, but when they arrived, the answer gutted them. "She was here," the nun said softly, "but she was ill. A man came for her, said he was her uncle. He took her." Odella's voice broke. "What man?" The nun frowned. "He had a scar down his cheek, rode a black horse, called himself Dallard." Odella swayed. "That was the trader's brother." Cade caught her arm. We will keep looking. The trail led them south, through Cheyenne lands and into Colorado territory. They asked questions in towns, tracked rumors and broken signs. Each night, Odella sat close to the fire, clutching that doll, and Cade kept watch. 3 weeks in, they found the man. He was drunk in a mining camp near Trinidad, bragging about a little girl he had traded off to a couple heading west. Cade hit him once, hard enough to drop him. The man spat blood and laughed. "You think you can find her now? She could be in California, boy." Odella's hands clenched. "You gave her away," she coughed all night, "thought she would die anyway." Cade drew his revolver, but Odella stopped him. "Do not. He is not worth it." They tracked the couple for 4 more weeks. At last, in a valley near Santa Fe, they found a small homestead. A girl with dark hair and a faded dress was chasing chickens in the yard. "Mayra!" Odella cried. The girl froze. She was 6', but her eyes lit up when she saw Odella. She ran, arms outstretched. Odella dropped to her knees and caught her, holding her so tight the girl laughed and coughed all at once. The couple who had taken her in stood by the door, stunned. "We thought she was orphaned," the woman said. "We did not know." Cade paid them $20 in cash. "For the food and care," he said. They left that night, the 3 of them riding north under the stars. Back at the cabin, Mayra slept in the bed while Odella and Cade sat by the fire. She looked at him, brow furrowed. "You spent everything you had." "I would spend more," he said. "She is not your blood. She is yours. That is enough." Odella reached out, touched his hand. "You bought me for $2. I never saw it that way." "I did," she said softly. "At first, I thought it meant I was worth nothing." Cade turned his hand, laced his fingers with hers. "You are worth everything I have." Odella leaned forward just enough. He met her halfway. The kiss was slow, careful, full of all the things they had not said but everything they had shown. When she pulled back, tears shimmered in her lashes. "I ain't used to being wanted." He touched her cheek. "You are not wanted, you are loved." She leaned into his palm, eyes closing. "Then I am staying. For good." Cade smiled, the first real one in years. "Good." The spring thaw softened the ground around the cabin, and with it came the slow settling of a new life. Snowmelt from the mountains fed the river fat and fast, and the air carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth. Cade built a fence down by the grazing field while Mayra followed Odella through the woods, learning how to spot wild onion shoots and early morels. The girl took to the land like she'd never been parted from it. She laughed when she ran, her dark braid bouncing behind her, and her voice, thin and raspy when they'd first brought her home, had grown steady with use. Odella watched her closely but never hovered. She let her run, let her fall, let her pick herself up. Cade noticed that, one afternoon, as Odella scraped wax from jars in preparation for canning, Cade leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You ever done this before?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder. "No. But I watched my mother put up pears once. I think I remember enough." He stepped into the room, eyeing the row of empty jars. "We've got gooseberries coming in. Could try those." Odella wiped her hands on her apron. "Won't be sweet, but they'll keep. You don't mind the sour?" She looked at him then, her mouth quirking just slightly. "I've had worse." Cade chuckled low in his throat and picked up a jar. "You want me to build another shelf?" "We'll run out of space come harvest." She nodded and turned back to the wax. "Put it high. Mayra's got long arms when she wants something." They worked in tandem most days now. He watched how she moved through the house like it had grown around her rather than the other way around. She stitched new curtains from an old petticoat, scrubbed soot from the hearthstones, and started keeping a notebook by the window with entries on planting dates and weather patterns. She never wasted words when she spoke, but he found he liked the sound of her voice in the quiet. That evening, after Mayra had fallen asleep curled beside the dog on a pallet by the fire, Odella stepped out onto the porch. Cade followed, handing her a tin cup of hot chicory. She accepted it with a small nod. "You always this quiet?" He sat down on the stoop beside her. "I figure noise doesn't fix much." She sipped and stared out at the moonlight curling over the hills. "I used to think silence meant something bad was coming." He looked over at her. "What does it mean now?" "I don't know yet." She cradled the cup in both hands. "Maybe just room to breathe." A coyote called far off. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she said, "You ever think about what you'd be doing if I hadn't come along?" "Sometimes," he answered. "But the thought never holds." Odella glanced at him. "Why?" He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "Because nothing before feels real anymore, just distant, like it happened to someone else." She drew her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to vanish." "It won't," he said. She didn't answer, but he saw her shoulders ease just a little. The next morning, Mayra woke with a fever. Cade saddled the mare before dawn and rode to the trading post 4 miles east, returning with willow bark and a fresh bolt of muslin. Odella brewed bark tea and kept cool cloths on the girl's skin while Cade whittled a new toy horse by the fireside. By the third day, the fever broke. Odella sat at the edge of Mayra's bed, brushing damp hair from her daughter's forehead. "She's strong," she whispered. Cade handed her the toy horse. "So's her mother." She took it without speaking, pressed it into Mayra's hands. Later, after the child had fallen into deeper sleep, Odella found Cade behind the cabin, repairing the chicken coop door. She stood silently for a long moment, then said, "You didn't hesitate." He kept working. "Didn't see a reason to. You could have stayed out of it, let me handle it." "I didn't want to." She stepped closer. "That's the second time you've said that." He looked up at her then, sun catching in his pale lashes. "And I'll say it again if you let me." Odella reached for his wrist, her thumb brushing a small nick just below the cuff of his sleeve. "I don't know what to do with someone like you." "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just stay." She nodded once, slow and sure. "I plan to." He laid down the hammer and took her face in his hands, thumbs along her jaw like she might startle if he moved too fast. But she didn't. She leaned into him, steady and warm. When they kissed again, it wasn't cautious. It was full, aching with every day they hadn't touched, every word they hadn't said. She pulled back just enough to whisper, "I want this. I want you." Cade rested his forehead against hers. "Then you have me. For good." Behind them, the wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere out in the brush, the first crickets of summer began to sing. The wheatgrass along the ridge swayed in slow waves, thick from late summer rain. Odella stood barefoot in the garden, her dress hem damp with dew, snapping green beans into a bucket resting against her hip. Mayra was nearby beneath the cottonwood, arranging pine cones in a circle and humming a tune Cade didn't recognize. He watched them from the barn doorway, the rasp of the whetstone pausing in his hand. He'd planned to mend the scythe blade before noon, but his eyes kept drifting back to the way. Odella tilted her head when she listened. How the morning sun caught the downy curls behind her ear. "You're staring again," she said without turning. He stepped into the light, squinting against it. "Can't help it." She dropped another bean into the bucket. "You've seen me every day for months now, thought the novelty would have worn off." "It's not novelty," he said. "It's knowing I got lucky." She set the bucket down and dusted her palms on her skirt. "I used to think luck was just something men said when they didn't want to admit they'd worked hard for something. You saying I worked for this?" He nodded toward the garden, the child, the cabin behind her. She crossed her arms. "I'm saying you didn't stumble into it." Cade nodded once and took a slow breath. "Then I'll keep at it, in case it tries to run off on me." Mayra called out then, holding up a crooked crown she'd made from willow twigs and bits of string. "Mama, can I be queen of the chickens?" Odella smiled for the first time that day, the kind that didn't fade when she looked away. "Only if you promise not to make them pay taxes." The girl giggled and ran toward the coop, crown bouncing on her head. Cade watched her go, then turned his eyes back to Odella. "I've been thinking," he said. "If we want her to start her letters this winter, she'll need paper. I could ride into Rawlins next week, pick up a slate and chalk too." Odella picked up the bucket. "She'll need a reader more than a slate." "You offering? Did I ever say otherwise?" She tilted her head. "You've never said much about what you want." "I want her learning," he said. "I want you warm every night. I want more beans than we can eat, and I want another room off the cabin." "For when she grows." Odella stood still, fingers tightening around the bucket's handle. "That's a lot of want. I've got room for it." She looked away toward the trees. "I used to think men didn't stay. That they left when things got too settled, too real. I'm not most men." "No," she said softly. "You're not." A flock of geese passed overhead, their cries echoing across the hills. Odella turned toward the house and called for Mayra. "Dinner soon." Inside, the girl washed up while Odella set out cornbread and cabbage stew. Cade brought in firewood and noticed the way Mayra's braid had come loose. "You want me to fix that?" he asked. She nodded, climbing onto the stool. Cade took her hair gently, fingers clumsy but careful. "You ever do this before?" Odella asked from the stove. "No," he said. "But I watched you." Mayra sat still as he worked, and when he tied the end with a scrap of ribbon, she reached up and patted her head like a queen checking her crown. That night, after the girl had gone to sleep, Cade stepped outside to check the sky. The wind was shifting east. Behind him, Odella joined him on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "There's a fair over in Laramie in 2 weeks," she said. "Livestock, tools, cloth." "I thought maybe we could go." He glanced at her. "You want to?" "I ain't been to anything like that since Mayra was born," he nodded. "Then we'll go." She looked at him, eyes searching. "You keep giving me things I never asked for." "You gave me more than I ever thought I'd have," he said. "I'm just trying to match it." Odella stepped closer then, her hand finding his in the dark. "You're not behind, Cade." He brought her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "Still, I mean to keep pace." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Then we'll walk it together." 3 days after the first frost, Cade hitched the wagon with care, checking the bridles twice before nodding to Odella, who stood at the gate with a wrapped parcel tucked beneath her arm. Mayra bounced beside her in a hand-sewn coat, the sleeves rolled to fit. The fair in Laramie was a long haul, more than 60 miles, but they'd planned it with care. Extra oats for the horses, dried venison in the panniers, and enough coin hidden beneath the wagon boards to last them through both trade and winter. Odella climbed into the seat beside him, her gaze sweeping the sky. "We'll have cloud cover by evening." "You think it'll hold?" he asked. "Not long." He flicked the reins and they set off. The wagon rattled over the dry ridgeline, wheels groaning where the trail dipped into creeks. They passed a gathering of Ute riders south of Elk Hollow, who nodded once as they crossed, their ponies silent and sharp-eyed. Cade tipped his hat. Odella kept her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, but he saw her eyes tracking every face. They made camp that night beneath a red rock shelf, the fire tucked low against the wind. Mayra curled against Odella's side, half asleep before the stew had cooled. Cade sat across from them, his knees drawn up, watching the flames flicker against her face. "You ever been that far east?" he asked. "No," she said. "Closest I got was Fort Steele." He poked at the fire. "You nervous?" "I'm not sure what I'll feel once I'm there." He nodded, letting the fire speak for a while. "You?" she asked. "I ain't never taken anyone with me before." Whole place's gonna look different. She pulled the blanket tighter across Mayra's back. Maybe that's not a bad thing. The fairground spread across an open field north of Laramie, canvas tents pitched in rows, horses tied to lines strung between cottonwoods, and the smell of fried dough and pipe smoke drifting on the air. Mayra's eyes lit up before the wagon even stopped. Odella helped her down, smoothing her hair quickly. "Stay close." The girl nodded, already craning her neck toward the sound of fiddles and laughter. Cade paid for a stall to rest the horses, and they walked the grounds together, boots crunching over straw and frost. A woman selling ribbons caught Mayra's attention. Cade bought her one the color of dusk, and she tied it around her wrist like a bracelet. Odella paused at a stall where an older woman sold pressed flowers sealed in glass. She picked up a small oval frame with a sprig of yarrow inside. "You know what that one means?" the woman behind the stall asked. Odella shook her head. "Healing," the woman said. Odella looked at it a moment longer, then handed over a coin. Cade watched the exchange in silence. Later, as Mayra rode the carved elk on the hand-cranked carousel, Cade and Odella stood near the edge of the clearing. The wind had picked up, tugging at her sleeves. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly. She turned to him. "You mean after today or after this life?" "Somewhere in between." Odella folded her arms. "I think about how to make things last, how to raise her into someone who doesn't carry what I've carried, how to keep the roof dry and the smoke sweet." "That's what comes next." He studied her face, the firmness of her mouth, the steadiness in her gaze. "I think about putting a ring on your hand." She didn't speak right away. Her eyes went to Mayra, who was now waving from the carousel with both arms. "You do that?" she asked. "I've wanted to since the day I saw you in front of the sheriff's office." She looked back at him. "I didn't know it then." "I did." Odella took a breath that caught halfway and didn't let go. "I ain't never worn one." He reached into his coat pocket and held out a thin band of iron, shaped carefully, polished smooth. "I made it last week." "I thought you were fixing harnesses," she said. "I was. In between, I made this." She didn't reach for it. Instead, she stepped closer and took his face in her hands, not soft but sure. "I'll wear it," she said. "But not because you bought me, because you saw me." He slid it onto her finger. It fit. That night they slept in the back of the wagon, Mayra nestled between them beneath thick quilts. Outside, the fair quieted to lantern flicker and the low murmur of distant voices. Odella rested her hand against his chest, her fingers brushing the edge of his collar. "I never thought I'd be enough for someone," she said. "You were more than I ever knew to want." She didn't answer, just laid her head down and let sleep take her. Cade stayed awake a while longer, listening to the wind shift through the grass. One arm around the girl, the other curled around the woman he'd once bought with all he had, and who now held everything he was. By late October, the wind turned sharper, and the cottonwoods along the creek behind the cabin dropped their last leaves. Cade finished hanging the new door on the smokehouse while Odella stitched a quilt from old shirts and canvas scraps. The mornings grew quieter, the kind of quiet that seeps into bones not hollow but full. One afternoon, Mayra played beneath the porch, arranging small stones into rows. Odella sat nearby on a stool, her basket of mending at her feet. Cade came up from the pasture, brushing hay from his sleeves. "She told me she wants a lamb," he said, tugging off his gloves. Odella didn't glance up. "She's barely keeping the chickens fed. You planning to build that fence yourself?" "I figured we might all do it, after the ground thaws." She threaded her needle again. "She'll name it something ridiculous. I'm counting on it." That night after supper, Cade brought out a small wooden box. He set it on the table without a word. Mayra leaned over it with wide eyes as he lifted the lid. Inside sat a folded oilskin pouch, and beneath it a paper deed with clean ink strokes. Odella stood still, her hands damp from washing dishes. "What's that, land?" he said. "To the west of us, across the bluff. 30 acres." She blinked slowly. "Why? Better grazing and space to plant more." "I want us to have enough." Odella dried her hands on her apron, then stepped forward. "You didn't need to do that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." She rested a hand on the edge of the box. "You always thinking 10 years ahead. I'm thinking about her having something solid when she grows up." Odella looked down at the deed, then up at him. "I want that too." Mayra tugged at her sleeve. "Can I have a corner of it, for my lamb?" Odella smiled. "We'll see." The first snow came early, a light dusting that clung to the fence rails and softened the lines of the hills. Cade and Odella moved the livestock closer to the shed, and Mayra took to wearing wool stockings beneath her dresses, complaining loud enough for them both to hear. In the long evenings, Odella read aloud from the old book of Psalms they'd found in town. Mayra listened with her head on Cade's leg, her hand curled in his shirt hem. One night, as the wind tapped steady against the windows, Odella set the book aside and looked at him across the firelight. "I've been thinking," she said. "We should have a proper wedding." He leaned back against the hearthstones. "You want a preacher?" "I want the words, said out loud, with her there to hear them." He nodded. "Then we'll ask Dugan to ride out. He married my cousin and his wife." "He'll do it." She reached for his hand. "No rings, just our word." That's all I ever needed. They were married the following Sunday, just after noon, with the snow still clinging to the edges of the porch and a pot of stew hanging over the fire. Sheriff Dugan arrived with a flask tucked in his coat and a handkerchief folded neatly in his pocket. Mayra stood between them, holding a sprig of dried sage. "You got witnesses?" Dugan asked, voice low. Odella nodded toward the dog curled beneath the rocking chair. "He won't lie." They said the words soft and plain, hands linked, eyes steady. No promises they couldn't keep, only the ones they already lived by. Afterward, they ate bread with honey and drank warm cider while the wind picked up outside. Mayra climbed into Cade's lap and whispered, "Am I part of it too?" He kissed the top of her head. "You're the biggest part." Odella leaned against his shoulder. "We're all stitched in now." That winter passed slow and steady. Odella finished the quilt she'd started, and Cade built the bookshelves she'd asked for. Mayra learned her letters by candlelight, tracing Cade's name over and over with chalk on the slate. They weathered 2 storms and a fever that passed through town. Odella nursed a neighbor and came back with red-rimmed eyes but steady hands. Cade kept the fire going while she slept for a full day without waking. Come spring, they planted the new field. Odella marked the rows with twine while Cade turned the soil. Mayra carried seeds in a tin pail, her steps careful, her face solemn with effort. By the time the lilacs bloomed along the riverbank, the lamb had arrived, just as promised. Mayra named it Clover and built it a shelter from spare wood and an old flour sack. On the first warm evening of June, after supper and after the goats had been penned, Odella and Cade sat behind the house with their boots off, toes in the cool grass. "I never thought I'd get this," she said, watching the stars come out. "I never thought I'd know how to keep it," he answered. She turned to him. "But you did." He laid back against the slope, one arm behind his head. "We did." She rested her hand on his chest. "You still thinking 10 years ahead, only if you're still in it." "I will be," she said. "Long as you want me. I'll want you till the ground swallows me." She kissed him then, slow and sure, the grass whispering around them, the house behind them full of warmth and breath and light. And in the days that followed, they lived as if nothing had been taken from them, only given slowly, surely, and with hands that held tight.